Delighted to be here today. Thanks so much. It's great to be back in person. Being in this room reminds me of all the innovation that's actually happening in the market. So it's really exciting. And I'm excited to talk about methane emissions because they're responsible for 25% of global heating today. And that number has been increasing significantly since 2007. Methane's been getting a lot of attention in the news, as I'm sure you've noticed. And it's because it's such a critical greenhouse gas that we need to address. I'm going to cover today who we are at Zefiro, why we're looking at methane, the size of the problem, how methane relates to abandoned and orphaned oil and gas wells, and I'll tell you about a new type of carbon offset that we're creating from methane abatement. So we're a project developer creating carbon offsets by plugging wells. These are wells that have just been left and haven't been taken through the end-of-life services. Our team is part of the team is based here in New York, and the rest of us are primarily down in Florida. Obviously, I'm not from New York, bright orange jacket. I was walking here this morning and I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm going to be mugged. I'm obviously a tourist. Now, we've heard a little bit today about methane and the sources of methane. I wasn't sure how many people were going to speak about methane today, but I'll just remind you that methane emissions come from landfills, rotting waste, agricultural activities, in particular cattle. And the third sector is the oil and gas sector. And 40% of human-caused methane emissions come from this sector, particularly from E&P activities, exploration and production, and transportation. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. When averaged over 100 years, it is, which actually the reason we use 100 years is because that's what's used in the reporting inventories. Methane's global warming potential is 25 times greater than that of the equivalent mass of carbon. If you look at it from a standpoint of 20 years, its global warming potential is 84 times greater. Since methane is relatively short-lived in the atmosphere, taking action to reduce methane would dramatically slow the overall energy being absorbed. So if you think of it, methane emissions present both massive warming, but it also a golden opportunity to have an immediate impact on reducing emissions. We're seeing out in the field that 90% of the wells that are abandoned and orphaned are leaking methane. And we're also seeing that 20 to 30% of those, it's a big number, are registering significant leaks. Now, this is all new data, and we're gathering data as well. There have been some papers written on it, but they're finding that the methane leaks are much bigger than originally thought. How big is the problem? There are 2.3 to 4 million abandoned and orphan wells across the states. That means 280 to 420 million tons of CO2e. That's a lot. There's money being put toward this problem, but it's really a small amount compared to what's needed to address the problem. Now, I'm certainly not picking on oil and gas, don't get me wrong. That is part of the energy mix that we still need. It's important, but we also need this sector to get on board with the cleanup of emissions. Tackling leaks from fossil fuel sites is the fastest and the cheapest way to slash methane emissions. In the news last week, Shell came out with an article and they announced that they fear increased scrutiny over their O&G operations due to the impact that it has on climate or warming, and that they felt that could potentially damage their business. They made some big commitments, good for them, to finding solution for emission reductions. And I mention this just to point out that the O&G sector is concerned and they're looking for ways to reduce emissions. Imagine if we took the entities that are the farthest apart in terms of being aligned in their goals. That would be the oil and gas sector and environmental folks, right? If we were able to get them in a room, two sides of the coin, and have conversations and find a middle ground to create solutions, that would be pretty awesome for the carbon markets, right? Not to tout Zefiro, but that is what we're trying to do. That's part of our work and what we're trying to do at Zefiro. Orphaned and abandoned wells exist in most states. And in fact, we have a number of documented orphan wells right here in New York State. Does anybody want to garner a wager how many documented orphaned wells we have in New York State? Yes. How many? 75,000. We have 1,000. Right. So there are over 7,000 documented wells. Now, we do think the number is much greater than that for undocumented wells. And as you can see, the funding to remediate wells is grossly insufficient, and therefore innovative and efficient solutions are required to ensure that these emissions are prevented as quickly as possible. This is why carbon offsets for methane abatement are an important piece to the puzzle. Methane leaks and leaking wells have been attracting more attention from both the media and government officials. That's good news for the carbon market. The bipartisan infrastructure bill has provided funds for cleaning up orphaned wells, and the Inflation Reduction Act, I'm so used to calling it the IRA, is seeking to incentivize methane emission reduction as well. We at Zefiro, we're playing a part in helping to address the problem of methane emissions in upstream oil and gas. And here you see our CEO, Kurt Hopkins. He doesn't know I put his picture in there, so I hope he's not watching. He's actually detecting methane at the wellhead there. He's using one of our pieces of equipment to do the detection. We're expecting the release of new methodologies. There are a couple coming to market imminently. ACR is working on a methodology. Vera is working on a methodology. And there are some other ones from some more offline registries that are also putting together an AOOG methodology. So we're excited about that. In a plugging job, we physically seal the well and we generate carbon offsets through the prevention of further emissions. Now, there are steps in between. We just completed our pilot project in Louisiana. We're very excited about that, and we're on our way to creating offsets. We have a 4-stage process for abating the emissions and generating the offsets. Step 1, we obtain the right to plug the wells and take ownership of the associated environmental attributes. And we do expect there will be additional environmental attributes because the water table is also affected by this problem. Step 2, we measure and document the level of emissions, both before and after plugging the leaking well. This type of offset is easy to quantify because we directly measure the baseline emissions instead of having to make any assumptions about it. And as someone who's been in the carbon market for a while, I'm excited to see easily quantifiable, high-quality emission reductions coming to market. Step 3, experienced plug-in professionals carry out the work of sealing the wells and preventing further emissions. Of course, we are required to test post-plugging, and we look for atmospheric leakage at that point. And any leaks result in a reduction of carbon offsets, as you would expect. But because we're creating carbon offsets from plugging the wells, we're more incentivized than a non-project developer would be to ensure the integrity of the plugging job. It's a very important piece. Step 4, our emission reductions are verified by a third party, just like any other carbon offset project. And then we request issuance of the offsets. As I mentioned before, these offsets have synergy with the sector that is now on board with finding ways to decarbonize. Scaling, plugging, and abandonment work is also a strategic option for providing employment for those laid off from the oil and gas industries. And for that reason, this type of offset meets SDG 8, which is full and productive employment. And the project also meets SDG 13, as you would expect, which is addressing climate change. As you can see in the graph, and I think everybody's already aware in this room, there's a massive gap in the supply and demand curves. What's interesting is even last year, and certainly for the 5 years before that, there was a race to the bottom in terms of corporates buying offsets. Entities wanted the cheapest offset, and I see a few people shaking their head. They just wanted the cheapest offset so that they could market and say, oh, we bought X number of offsets, we spent X dollars on offsets. Now, corporates are requesting higher quality offsets. And this is great news for the carbon markets. And we hope to play a role in meeting the demand for high quality offsets. Emissions from orphaned and abandoned oil and gas wells are going to be a major topic in the ESG space in 2023. And we are proud to be establishing our voice in this space as we build our market presence. Thank you. Oh, and I just want to say, I'll take questions, but I think we have time for one or two. Also, if you put your business card in the bowl up here, you'll have a chance of winning this bottle of scotch. I drank some of it before I spoke. Sorry.
Questions for Tina at the back.
Hi, Tina. Very interesting presentation. Luda Siegel from Constellation. So I'm a little bit confused as how the companies are not being held accountable for plugging the wells. There is no such legislation that if you write the well is depleted, you're supposed to plug it? So any information would be great on that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a great question. So abandoned wells are just left sitting, and there hasn't been regulation saying you have to plug this thus far. I do expect that there will be one day, and hopefully it will be enforced, but at the moment it's not. And the orphan well, which is even a worst case scenario, it's just left and they can't even identify the owner. So if you can't identify the owner, there's no responsible party for the well. So that's why we go in and do the end of life services on it. Thanks for that question.
Yes, another one over here. The question was who owned the wells originally?
Now, operators originally owned the well, but you can't, yes, and sometimes state, but if you can't track it back, it truly is an orphaned situation.
I can't help but asking a commodity question. When you curate this portfolio of abandoned orphaned wells, is there an opportunity on the front end for some small percentage of those to recomplete, swab, do some of the more environmentally friendly EOR technologies, that there's a separate just sort of commercial revenue stream? When you think about, why a well gets abandoned, it's a mom-and-pop operator, they didn't have access to those economies of scale or even that thought process. Like, do you guys think about that from a commercial standpoint before you bifurcate that portfolio into the sort of oil and gas commercial side versus the carbon commercial side?
Yeah, there certainly is that opportunity. Absolutely. We're looking at wells that have just been left, and they're already past that opportunity. But I think for ownership, before they get to that point in time of actually abandoning, there is that opportunity. Yeah, thank you.